So I want to talk about worship as an everyday practice. And so what I want to talk about really is that worship is here to remind us that who we are and that we're one with God. It's a means by which we can find God and by which we can find ourselves. You know, God really doesn't need us to pray. God doesn't demand that we pray. God doesn't care, actually. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but you know, what we do, what we teach when we pray is we pray to find our center and to reconnect with Spirit. And I'm guessing that probably almost everybody here, when we were growing up, if we followed some kind of religious trait, we were taught that worship meant following a whole set of rules, that we showed our love for God by fasting, by you had to go to church every Sunday, by not eating certain foods, and oftentimes the rules became an end to themselves. And I've told this story a long time ago before, but I was really good friends with a priest, a Monsignor named Tom Scanlon. And one day he was telling me this story when he was in the seminary, and he was a really young guy, like 18, 19 years old. One Thursday, he spent all day in school and the whole rest of the day in the library. So all day long, now he's in school studying, he's in the library reading, or he's praying or whatever, and he goes home, and when he gets home, he's starving. And he's like, you know, like I said, he's 18, 19, he doesn't know anything about cooking, and the only thing he can cook is bacon and eggs. So he starts to cook himself bacon and eggs, and the aroma of the bacon, this is a Thursday now, the aroma of the bacon wakes up his sister, who comes running downstairs and says, Tom, what are you doing? And he said, I'm making myself bacon and eggs. And she said, look at the clock, it's 12:15, it's Friday, and you're eating meat. And when he told me that story, he said, I really got how irrelevant that was. He said, here I was, I'm working all day praying in the library and doing all of this. Do you really think God's going to be mad at me for having a couple of slices of bacon when I'm starving? You know, that's what I mean by it becomes an end in itself, and that's not what it's about. You know, in the Bible, Jesus was rebuked for doing healing on Saturday, on the Sabbath. And he reminded the people that were rebuking him, he said, this is for all of us. The day is for all of us. You know, it's a tool and an instrument. It's not an end for itself. It's to remind us of our relationship with Spirit. You know, when we live like everything is sacred, when we live a life that every day is worship, when we take time to spread love, to spread compassion, to spread joy, to spread peace, when we appreciate the gift of life, when we see God in everything, then our life becomes a constant prayer. Our life becomes the prayer we need to speak. Worship is a matter of the heart, not a matter of the rule book. And when we open our hearts to all of the beauty and all of the goodness that surrounds us, we can't help to become, if I could paraphrase St. Francis, an instrument of God's peace. You know, Ernest Holmes wrote, an hour a day spent in silent meditation will not save us from the confusion of life. 51% of a man's thinking is what counts. And it's another way of saying, you know, it's good to meditate, but we have to do more than meditate. So Lama Surya Das is he's a Buddhist Lama. He's also a Jewish guy from Massachusetts. And in one of his books, he tells a story of how the point that I just made was brought home to him. And it was brought home by an elderly Buddhist nun who early in her life had been an assistant to a Grand Lama. And she said, so when she worked for him, what she really loved was to get her meditation time in. So she would kind of rush through her chores so she could get time to meditate. And she said, and all of a sudden, every time I sat down to meditate, somebody would come and say, the Rinpoche wants to see you. And by the way, Rinpoche, it's an honorary title that means precious one. And she said, every single time I would sit and meditate, I'd get a tap on the shoulder, the Rinpoche needs to see you. She said, week after week. And so she said to him, at some point, I said to myself, I must make everything I do my meditation. So she started to do that. And she said after she did it for a couple of weeks, he called her in and she said he had this twinkle in his eye. And he said, you know, I think I won't be interrupting your meditations as much anymore. And she really got it again, because the moral was every moment is sacred. And so don't rush through everything else, because it's all sacred. And that's why he was interrupting her. That was his way of teaching her that lesson. So Barbara DeAngelis, I talked about her before, and she's written some great books. She wrote that when she became a seeker, she turned away from everything worldly, and she used to spend hours in meditation. And she would go to retreats year after year, and she would spend time in silence. And she said, at some point, I realized the only time I was happy is when I was doing my spiritual practice. And then it occurred to me that all of human life is a spiritual practice. And what I was here for was I was supposed to practice being a human being. And so she gave up some of that and started to live and practice it in her daily life. You know, when we separate the spiritual from every day, we miss so much. When we're consumed by looking for what's extraordinary, we don't recognize the sacred when it happens to us, when we experience it. We get so distracted, we forget what's important. Some of you might remember the singer Pearl Bailey. Pearl Bailey once said, people see God every day, they just don't recognize him. And so what are some of the things we can do to help? We can develop a spiritual practice. And what does a spiritual practice means? It means something we do every day that speaks to us. And you know, it could be a whole bunch of things. I wrote a bunch down. You know, we can pray, we can meditate, we can read, we could go for a walk, we could do yoga, we could do Tai Chi, we could listen to music, we could take classes, we could join a spiritual community, we could do whatever speaks to our heart. And Deepak Chopra once said, God can't be found in a book of religion, meaning, you know, it's out here in the world that we find it. So I read something this week. I'm just going to go over three people that some of you might know about how they do their spiritual practice. And the first one is Arianna Huffington. Most of you probably Huffington Post. And one day when she was running the Huffington Post, she totally collapsed at her desk. And when she woke up, she had blood pouring out of her head because she hit her head, I think on the point of the desk, and she realized, I need to do something different. I need to change how I'm living because I've forgotten what's really important. And so what she did and what she does, she walks. That's her spiritual practice. And she said, I even started to hold meetings on hikes, which I'm sure the people I reported to her loved. But she said, it brings me a sense of joy and it brings me a sense of calm. And I read about a guy named Dan Harris. Some of you might know him. I think he's a co-anchor on ABC in the morning, or I don't know if he still is or he used to be. He had a panic attack on air, and he said it really embarrassed him. And he too realized he needed to do something a little different, so he meditates. And he said, you know, it only takes to begin 5 minutes a day to impact your life. And the last one I'll talk about is Marianne Williamson, who said she tries to live a life of loving. And she said, again, it doesn't need to be big things, you know, it could be holding a door for somebody. It could be when you see a coworker is frazzled, getting them a cup of coffee. It could, this next one to me is really big. It could be when you're driving, letting someone in the next lane get in front of you. I mean, that's really, that's like sainthood, you know. Nobody gets in front of you. So, I'm just kidding. Anyway, I was just curious. Anybody willing to share? Does anybody have a spiritual practice that they do every day that they'd be willing to share? Go ahead.
So, I don't know how, I guess I would just say show up. You know, when I wake up, I have some notion of my day, and almost immediately through outside circumstances, it doesn't go that way. But whatever happens, show up and respond to it with the intent, you know, with good intentions, I guess I could say. You know? And then you don't have to worry. I don't worry about it. I just, whatever happens that day, I try to show up.
That's kind of like what Marianne Williamson was saying. Anybody else do anything every day?
I don't know if it's every day, but it's when it comes up. Started years ago in my home, leaving the house and getting into the car and remembering something that I forgot in the house, and you know, as soon as I remember, oh, whatever. And I changed that to, oh, thank you, because I was remembering something that I needed. So
Well,
saying
that's really, yeah.
thanks when you remember something you
Yeah.
forgot.
Yeah, I said that last Sunday, we forgot my dog. I didn't say, oh, thank you for that. Go ahead.
Whenever I'm in traffic and somebody's very aggressive and maybe cuts me off, I say a prayer for them.
Oh,
Cool. This could be somebody's son, it's somebody's brother, maybe somebody's father. God forbid it's somebody on the way to the hospital. I say a prayer.
You know, that's really interesting, because that happened to us the other day. Somebody cut me off, and my initial reaction was to really get upset, but it was right in front of a medical center. And I said to I really caught myself right away, and I said, you know, maybe somebody in her family is really sick, or maybe she's getting herself to the ER, so let's just say a prayer. Yeah. Anybody else? Go ahead.
Actually, you reminded me, I say a prayer every time I hear a siren.
Oh,
For those who run to save and those they're running to save.
thank you, Carol. I said nothing.
When I'm quite not in the mood to pray and somebody cuts me off, I just say, oh, jerk, it's your turn to be a jerk. I did something, I pulled out in front of somebody last week.
Yeah.
I didn't see them, so you know what they were calling me, so.
Anybody else? All right, so here, you know, here's an exercise that you can try that I read about this week. Just choose one thing to do. You know, and I just read a whole bunch. Choose one and commit to do it every day for a week. Just start out every day for 1 week and see what happens. See if you have more inner peace. Check your stress level. See how your emotions are, and see how it affects you. You know, I talked about this maybe not so long ago, but I read about it. Cardinal Berardine, who I won't go through the whole story, but he's passed on now. But he made a commitment that every day he would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and he would spend 2 hours reading, praying, and meditating. And what he wrote was, not all of the days are good, you know. Some days, I guess, you're tired. Some days your mind wanders. You know, anybody that meditates knows that. He said, but it didn't matter. That's my 2 hours with God every day. So, you know, a spiritual practice, it raises our consciousness. It touches every area of our life. And it's a path to perfection, not a result of it. So I want to give you another real life example that made a huge difference in my life. So I have to tell you something about myself. I have always prided myself as being great in an emergency. Any kind of emergency, I am really good at responding to. In fact, when I worked for SmithKline Corporation, one of my bosses said to me, I've never managed anybody who was as good in a crisis as you are. Too bad you're not that good in everyday stuff. And so, towards the end of her life, I've talked about this, my mother never really talked to me much, but I was an only child, and she was in the hospital, and they told us that she could never go home again, that for lots of different reasons, she needed to go to a nursing home, and they were gonna have this big meeting at the hospital with doctors and nurses and social workers and stuff, and to break the news to her that she could never go home again. And for some reason, even though we didn't get along really well, that really grabbed me, and I couldn't, and they also told me, you need to lead the meeting. And I couldn't imagine telling somebody, you're never gonna see the place where you've lived for years. You're never gonna get to even empty out your closets or pick the stuff that you want. And I went to my wife and I said, I can't do this. I can't. I don't know how the hell I'm gonna tell her, much less lead a meeting. And she turned to me and she said, you don't have to. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I'll do it. She said, you're an only child, you don't get along with her, you gotta be there. She said, but you just sit alongside me and I will lead the meeting. Just be with me. We got to the meeting and the social worker led it, so all of my stress really. And then after the meeting, now try to picture this, my wife, her name is Barbara, she disappeared. So now I'm sitting there with this woman who does not speak to me and has told me fairly recently she hated me, and we're stuck together in this seat. And nobody knows where Barbara went. About half hour or 40 minutes later, she reappears, and she had walked about 8 blocks to my mother's favorite Italian restaurant and got all our favorite meals and brought them back, okay? That's the story. Why do I tell you? Way long after my mother died and Becky and I are together, Barbara and I are obviously divorced, and my attorney told me that it was one of the 2 most contentious divorces he had ever handled. And we couldn't speak on the phone. I had custody of the kids. We couldn't talk on the phone about the kids. We couldn't, even if I thought about calling her, I was yelling at her, you know, and vice versa. And then I read an article that said, you know, when you're going through what we were going through, not being able to speak, and you've been in a relationship for years, the bad stuff is like a picture in time. Try to go into a quiet place and remember the good times. Remember the time that you loved the person and that she loved you and things were good, and it can change. And when I did it, I decided to do it, the story I just told you is what came to mind. And that story led to forgiveness, and it led to healing. And I think of it now as a form of worship, as a form of sacredness, where somebody cared enough when I couldn't do what I thought was mine to do, to say, it's okay, I love you, I'll do it. That's what worship in everyday life is about. That's what an example of it. I read an article this week by a fellow named Steve McSwain, who quoted a psalm, and the psalm was, be still and know that I am God. He said, what that means, in the original Hebrew is to release, to relax, to let go of control. And he said, it means in some way to stop trying to find God, because God isn't lost. To the question, he said the question, how do I find God, is the wrong question, because separation is an illusion. The presence, and this is something from Becky's reading, the presence you seek is the person you are. So I want to close with something from Jack Kornfield, who's a Buddhist teacher. And he writes that his father was dying, and Jack went to be with him. And his father was terrified of dying, and especially for some reason dying in his sleep, and nobody would realize he died. So he wouldn't sleep for more than 3 minutes at a time. And Jack said his father was a brilliant person, but he was violent-tempered and physically abusive. And he said, but years before, I made my peace with him, and I love him. And so he would be there, and because his father was so scared, he tried to teach him meditation, and he tried to teach him breathing techniques, and they didn't work. And one day Jack said to him, I'm so tired, I've been here so much, I need to go. Excuse me, I need to go, I need to get some sleep. And his father said, no, please, please, don't go, stay here with me. And so he did. And he said, I held his hand. His dad was so scared, he didn't want to talk. He just wanted Jack to be with him. So they sat in silence with Jack holding his hand. And then a few days later, his father died. And this is what Kornfield wrote, and this is how I'll end. He said, perhaps this is the best we can do, to help where we can, to witness each other with kindness, to offer our presence, to show the trust we have in life. Spiritual life is not about knowing much, but about loving much. God bless you. Thank you for being here. Have a great day.